Hello. Following on from my last Final Fantasy installment where we were looking at Final Fantasy VIII, today I want to look at a Square game I hold in equally high esteem, Final Fantasy IX. Now, Final Fantasy IX is something of a milestone in gaming history, or at least I should say Square's history, because this marked the last of the PlayStation 1 installments of Final Fantasy, and with it was the end of a lot of the traditional JRPG traits, and indeed, the conventional Final Fantasy traits that players up until this point, had been used to. And as if kind of prescient of this milestone, Square sought to make a game that was something of a nostalgia trip for gamers. It was a chronological punctuation mark wherein the relatively recent features of futuristic or steampunk worlds that we've seen in 6, 7 and 8, these are all kind of thrown out and dramatically shifted back towards a much more conventionally fantasy setting. So, for example, we now have kind of palaces and knights and mages, as a tribute to the earliest Final Fantasies that were published. So, looking back at Final Fantasy IX in its respective chronology, as it was sandwiched between Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X, here as a historical piece of Squaresoft history, we can really get a sense of the enduring appeal that this game had and probably still does have, because it's so distinct from anything we've really had from this era of gaming, or indeed since what we've seen since from Square. So it suffixed the last of the super futuristic fantasies that we saw with Final Fantasy VIII, which had Esthar and all these kind of more futuristic elements like gunblades and that sort of thing, and spaceships, but it prefixed the relentless push that Square is now having towards the more modernized game, the voice acted game, and the increasingly less JRPG gaming style that each canonical game has gone on to have. So Final Fantasy IX is a bit of an anomaly, and it's an installment to the series that lifts the gamers out of this relentless pushing towards the new and innovative that Square seems to be going towards. So I find it quite a revitalising game. I really enjoy it to this day. I'm still kind of constantly playing it, at least once a year. So I think there's a lot of significance regarding this game historically, but like all Final Fantasies, there is a wealth of discussion to be had regarding the story, character, the setting, and that's why I feel it deserves discussion, much like the Final Fantasy VIII video that I did. So with massive games like this, it's kind of hard to know where to start, but when it comes to Final Fantasy IX, I think the thing I'd most like to point out first is the art direction. The art style of Final Fantasy IX is something that instantly makes it stand out from other installments. The character design, the locations, the general aesthetics are just absolutely fantastic, and this game is really the last main Final Fantasy where we get to see these kind of abstracted avatars for our characters. Everything since has been geared towards more figurative realism, simply because they have the technology to do that now. But I really like that the characters in this game are abstracted on purpose, for stylistic and nostalgic purposes, not due to graphical limitations like earlier games. So of course, Final Fantasy VIII, we saw the first instance of figurative realism that we had. Everything was realistically proportioned in that game. So Square could have done it if they'd wanted to, but I think for a story and setting like Final Fantasy IX, where you have tree cities like Clara and anthropomorphic rats and castles and princesses and that sort of thing, I think the art style really kind of fits perfectly with this, and I can't really conceive of this game being done in a more realistic way, and I'm not sure it would have worked quite as well if it had been done that way. So yeah, while this art style probably was done exclusively as a nostalgic nod to earlier titles, I think it surpasses this throwback gesture and actually coalesces really well with other aspects of world and story to create something that's overtly medieval, well, certainly European, but they seem to mesh medieval with elements of Victorianism. So for example, Dr. Top is dressed pretty much as a Victorian, with the 17th century sort of pirate aesthetics that we get with Marcus and Vivi's cuffs, for example. So yeah, they've got this meshing of European heritage that just comes comes together with this sort of more manga style character design. So there's something still quintessentially Japanese about this game, but also, you know, melded with this kind of, you know, European aesthetic as well. So, you know, I think it works really well, and the whole European and westernized aspect of Final Fantasy IX is actually intrinsic to not just the character design, but also, you know, the set pieces and themes of this game as well. I personally really get the impression from Final Fantasy IX that it's something that's almost self-aware and like it's being played out on a stage. So, for example, where games such as 7 and 8 strove to construe some semblance of reality, you know, albeit, you know, a futuristic or sci-fi orientated reality, Final Fantasy IX kind of throws that all out of the window and is very purposefully divorced from any aspects of realism or tangibility, and it's like one big abstract Shakespearean play. And I don't think it's an accident that we actually find our protagonist Zidane being part of a theatre troupe and plays, you know, for example, I Want to Be Your Canary, you know, is an aspect of the story and the narrative of this game. I don't think that's an accident. I actually think that it's very purposefully meant to be in this realm of the theatrical that we get from, you know, both the aesthetics and gameplay elements such as that. Just while we're talking about the theatrical aspect of Final Fantasy IX, I just want to digress very quickly to talk about the set pieces of this game, if we can call them that, the actual locations. This game is absolutely beautiful. The locations are fantastic, and I know in my Final Fantasy VIII video I stated that, you know, that was my favourite world, which is true, but I am very unfairly biased towards Final Fantasy VIII, as you may already realise. But the worlds of Final Fantasy IX are brilliant. You know, we have Alexandria, we have Lindeblum, we have Trino. These locations are just fantastic. These are wonderful set pieces. They're great locations that are well realised, well designed. And, you know, this is the last game where we get these pre-painted backdrops, which are so fantastically and, you know, painstakingly done. I just really like, you know, all the art direction and aesthetics of the world and setting of Final Fantasy IX is just so cohesive. Even the airships, which are, you know, completely divorced from, you know, reality, let alone history or any aspect of medieval Europe, but they slot in really well. This kind of odd steampunk dynamic that, you know, Square frequently employ just slots in really nicely, you know, with this game and the world that they've created for us. I also think that, you know, the world is very distinct from other games, such as, you know, you do a lot of running around as you always do on the first disc, but where you get kind of upgrades to forms of transport, which we get, you know, in 6, 7 and 8, Final Fantasy IX actually has pretty much zero sort of world map vehicalization. You know, we have chocobos, but they are, you know, kind of sidelined, much as they are in Final Fantasy VIII. But airship travel is pretty much the exclusive form of travel in this game, and I find it really quite interesting that they've opted to do that, because I don't think it's been done at the expense of having cool upgrades and ways to travel about. I think it's actually been done in a way that really augments the world that we're living in. You know, we don't have cars, we don't have, you know, any sort of advanced, you know, travel, barring airships and to a lesser extent boats. So just a really nice, well thought out world that I think, yeah, again, it just comes together very cohesively. Particular locations that, you know, I don't, you know, where I was saying Final Fantasy VIII, you know, I think Balamb Town's a beautiful location, and, you know, I have favourite locations. I think all of the locations here are absolutely brilliant in this game. They're all wonderfully done. They're all wonderfully have their own thematic and aesthetic, you know, kind of uniqueness. You know, Alexandria is beautiful, Lindeblum's beautiful, Trino's beautiful. You know, they're just lovely locations. So, yeah, moving swiftly into the actual game, because a lot of people found the big reveal of Final Fantasy IX somewhat indecipherable, particularly when we kind of move into the third and fourth discs, and this is where we discover that Terra, the planet Terra inside Gaia, and, you know, Garland, and we uncover this whole clone mystery. And I think, to be fair, that, you know, the delivery of this plot twist was actually quite poorly done. Not only is it a curveball out of nowhere without any kind of foreshadowing, but the dialogue and context is delivered quite sloppily too, and took me, reading a translation of the Automania on livestream.net to actually understand, what this whole Terra Gaia thing is properly. So, and indeed, this ties in with the crystal, which actually appears on the game's cover. I didn't really know what that was about until, much later into the game. So yeah, I don't think it was established particularly well. So, comparatively, if we look at Final Fantasy VII, where we had Meteor, Meteor was weaved credibly into the plot line because it was materia, so it was a summoned materia. And in Final Fantasy VIII, we have Ultimecia. Now, Ultimecia appears halfway through, but as I've mentioned before, this was weaved incredibly to the plot line because Ultimecia appears in the guise of Idea, for the first part of the game, and that's revealed to us, and it becomes quite evident, in the second disc. So, Final Fantasy IX, by comparison, literally offers nothing with regards to Zidane being a clone, this whole thing with Garland and Kuja being the evil twin. We literally don't understand any of that until much later in the game. Which is a problem for the grander and more macrocosmic narrative arc of this game. But the reason that I feel it succeeds despite this, and the reason that I think this overarching plotline matters significantly less than the grand plot, is because I consider Final Fantasy IX a much more character-driven game anyway, and it's an ensemble cast. I don't think there's one distinct hero like we have with Cloud, like we have with Squall. I think that this is an ensemble game. So this is evidenced right from the introductory montage, where each character has a panel conveying an image and then an emotional trait against their name. So, for example, Zidane has virtue, Amarant has arrogance, Steiner has dilemma, etc. And it's the plight of each of these respective characters that propels the game forward and makes it so interesting. We care about not just the grand overarching storyline, but actually about these small personal storylines and character growth and the redemption tales of each of these respective characters. So yeah, based on this, Final Fantasy IX is overtly, to me, an ensemble character piece that contrasts much more with earlier titles. And I think all of this actually relates back to the idea of Final Fantasy IX being played out on a stage, as it were, much like Shakespeare, or any piece of theatre for that matter. There's a cast of characters with their own traits and agendas, and anyone that has read a play knows, or a play in book format knows, a little synopsis of each character is actually prefixes the play. It's in the stage directions. So it seems very similar to me to the introductory panels of Final Fantasy IX, where we get this little bit of context for who's who, certain themes that are kind of attributed to them, but then these go on to be explored in much more depth in the actual game. So yeah, again, like Shakespeare, the respective scenes themselves and the words and the interplay between characters and their agendas is as important, if not more so, than the grander narrative of the piece, I think. And just to conclude this point, because you may think I'm just going off on a weird theory here, but I think the focus on character over the larger narrative is best exemplified through the introduction of active time events, because of course these don't generally contribute to the actual main plot of the game, but are more often than not used as little kind of off-stage scenarios of characters musing on certain themes. A common recurring one throughout the game is Vivi kind of pontificating on the finiteness of existence, and we also get scenes of Quina kind of threatening to eat people and kind of searching for food. So it's these sort of like little kind of mini subplots that show that this game is much more focused on character and personal character stories than it is on having a big grand theme that kind of goes all the way throughout it. So Final Fantasy IX begins in a very similar fashion to most Final Fantasy games, in that we are thrown into the action from a subjective, microcosmic perspective, which gradually unfolds and opens out into a macrocosmic, world-endangering dilemma. And to be fair, I find that the story, it does start off pretty solidly, and there is a slight discrepancy in the introductory gameplay to Final Fantasy IX, which sets it apart from other installments, and also relates back to the idea of this game being an ensemble character portrait. So where we initially take control of Zidane for the part, so for like the first 10 minutes of the game, we'll kind of take control of Zidane, and we get a bit of dialogue about the kidnapping of Princess Garnet. We then immediately transition to play as Vivi for a short segment, and then Steiner for a short segment before transferring back to Zidane. So what this does is it allows character development to begin almost immediately for each respective party member, and it gives them equal standing in both narrative terms and in terms of who we're kind of encouraged to kind of care about. And again, this just contrasts very sharply with Final Fantasy VII, which focuses on Cloud and only offers, you know, very short scenarios such as Cosmo Canyon and Wutai for background and development on, you know, other party members. So, and again, you know, Final Fantasy VIII, which I've already discussed, offers only very subtle development for the major cast. But, you know, again, that's something that I've spoken about before in a different video. So yeah, this kind of character equality and ensemble nature also extends into the combat system. So where you have dedicated RPG classes for each given character, so for example, Garnet is a white mage, so wields white magic and summons. Vivi is a black mage, so wields the offensive spells, and Zidane is a thief, so, you know, has the steal and mug kind of capabilities. Again, this is good because unlike 7 and 8, and to a certain extent 10, you know, 9 in fact creates a necessity for each character to be around and in the party at a given time, and strategy relies quite heavily on who you have equipped for what. So, I mean, digressing on this point, I think it's quite a blessing and a curse depending on your outlook and what you take from these games. I mean, personally, I actually quite like the blank slate characters you can build up and then equip, because then you can base your party on who you like personally. But I do like how kind of Square have mixed this up a bit and prevented, you know, the formula for the battle systems in each game, you know, being too similar. And again, it does tie in with the inclusivity of the game, not to mention, you know, that the combat system returns back to a party of 4 as well. So I do kind of consider this on the whole a positive, you know, with the battle system, apart from the trance limit breaks, which I'm going to omit them from this conversation, because any of you that have played this game will know that trance is probably one of the worst battle dynamics that's ever existed in a Final Fantasy game, so we won't even talk about that. But so yeah, sorry, back to the story here. The bare bones story of this game is actually really quite convoluted, as I've already mentioned. It basically involves a planet called Terra, which feeds off the life crystals of other planets to sustain itself. And basically, the result of this is it will cause the destruction of Gaia, which is the overworld that we inhabit. And it does this because it needs to perpetuate the ancient souls living on Terra, which, you know, is a planet that has now merged and happens to exist inside of Gaia. So this plot sounds completely mental, but actually it does follow in a certain Final Fantasy convention, in that there are remnants of ancient beings still affecting the contemporary events of the game. So Final Fantasy VII had the Cetra, Final Fantasy VIII had the Centra, and Final Fantasy X had the Machina-wielding ancestors of Zanarkand. So I think, for the record, all these games integrated the ancient race dynamic, but it just so happens that they happen to do it a lot better than Final Fantasy IX did. So, you know, with each of these other games, they all drop hints and tidbits and, you know, elements that references, you know, this ancient race or whatever as the game goes on until the plot opens out. Whereas Final Fantasy IX keeps it right up until like Disc 3, until you finally confront Garland, who's randomly thrown in at this juncture too. There's no allusion to him. And he just proceeds to kind of spout out all this narrative stuff at you in one massive chunk. So yeah, but I mean, as I've said, the macrocosmic reveal of Final Fantasy IX, it doesn't matter so much, because this game is driven by character plot lines, the intricacies of the gameplay, and the really good side quests and mini games that make it entirely worth playing. One thing I will say though for Garland is that even though he's seemingly a random addition, he is pretty cool, and he's one of the few truly ambiguous antagonists we actually get in the Final Fantasy series, because he's not overtly evil. He's just trying to achieve his own subjectively, to him, moral aims that, happen to be at the expense of another planet, and they don't happen to align well with the inhabitants of Gaia. So I think probably the best thing that could have happened for this game, and although, I don't want to dwell in hypotheticals, but I would have probably scrapped Kuja as a kind of red herring bad guy and had Garland as taking centre stage for the main antagonist role. Okay, so winding back, let's start talking about the characters. As I've said, it's an ensemble game, it's a character-driven game. So let's start talking about the characters and the themes that they embody. So each character in this game comes to the stage with their own plight, their own issues to work out. And as I covered in my Final Fantasy VIII video, there's a key theme that's explored through these characters. In most Final Fantasies we have a core theme. So in terms of Final Fantasy IX, I feel that the plight of these characters coalesces towards the theme of identity, whether this is literal in the case of Zidane and Garnet, whose origins aren't actually what they first appear to be, or indeed much more metaphorical or psychological. So, for example, Vivi's turbulent journey towards reconciling himself as a self-aware, albeit constructed being, and Steiner's very gradual shift into self-determination and self-governance over blind loyalty to a clearly flawed Queen Brownie. And these themes and narratives, I feel they contrast very starkly, and I think balance really quite well with the relatively upbeat and breezy feel of Final Fantasy IX's world, because despite the turbulent events of the characters and the evil plottings of Kuja, the world of Final Fantasy IX is really one of playful, quasi-medieval optimism. And it elicits a sense of transition here through the developing steam and airship technology. The Gaia we inhabit is at a golden age of progress and communication that in a lot of ways could be compared to the Industrial Revolution across Europe and the United States in the 18th century. And this is the 19th century, and this is augmented in the game by these colourful, motley inhabitants we have, who are really kind of theatrical and more often than not quite comical in terms of both aesthetics and dialogue. And this ranges from kind of semi-significant sub-characters such as Prince Puck, right down to the angry pickle seller who kind of always moans in Linda Bloom's business district. But first I just want to quickly discuss and reinforce the idea of this Final Fantasy game being more overtly westernized and medieval by discussing the etymology of the names we have here. So, where earlier Final Fantasies have names that are either metaphorical, such as Squall, Rain, and Laguna from Final Fantasy VIII, somewhat abstract, such as Zell or Cloud, or otherwise overtly fantasy-sounding, such as Tidus and Shadow, Final Fantasy IX has character names with a very distinct European, and at the very least kind of Western heritage, which tie in with both the references made to Shakespeare and the medieval aesthetic of the rest of this game. We have minor characters such as Marcus and Cinna, and these have very distinct Latinized Roman names, and it's been argued before that they are named after two characters in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, which again ties in with the theatre troupe trade that they operate in. We have the Nero twins of the Tantalus troupe also appear to have taken a name from the Roman Emperor Nero, who was the fifth Roman Emperor after the Republic. And Tantalus, the word itself, actually stems from a Greek myth about King Tantalus, who offended the gods and was forever suspended in a river, being unable to reach this branch of fruits that was hanging just above him. So yeah, it's quite interesting there. We also have the Mognet character, Stiltskin, and Stiltskin has origins in the German language, and it has phonetic ties with, for example, we have like Rumpelstiltskin, which is a folklore character here. Another example would be, the summons, which are called Eidolons, which is taken from an old Greek word for apparition. And these are just a couple of the very numerous kind of peripheral characters and elements of this game that are rooted in Western etymology. Moving into the main cast, we have, for example, Freya, which is a name that is of Scandinavian origin, referring to the Norse goddess from which we get the word Friday. Literally, Freya's day. Beatrix is an English name. Zidane is French. Adalbert Steiner is German. Garnet and Amarant are English words. And of the main recurring cast, it's only really Baku, Quina and Eiko that have distinctly Japanese names that I can really think of. So what we see here is a Final Fantasy that is firmly rooted in a more familiar etymological scape, and one that draws on the real world, perhaps a little more than we've hitherto seen with any of these games so far. So now that we've kind of established a context here, let's start profiling these characters and how their stories kind of contribute to the ensemble nature of the storytelling. Turning first to Zidane, who is certainly the lead character in terms of who we play as most often, the romantic lead, I suppose, and indeed, he was the focal point of marketing for this game. Now, Zidane's slide in the opening montage says, "Virtue, you don't need a reason to help people." And I think this aptly conveys the essential nature of this character, and it's really kind of a welcome break, I think, from the protagonists we've seen in the previous few installments. He's generally an enthusiastic and optimistic protagonist, and looking at the preceding installments of the series, where we had overtly somber and troubled heroes, I think this works well and is successfully divorced from the existential crisis, that we've seen previously. The only trait of Zidane that I actually find mildly unsettling is how amorous he is, because with these overtly cartoonish art styles, it just comes across as slightly weird when we see him kind of groping Garnet. But otherwise, his disposition is quite a new take for the series. And although it's somewhat aped by Tidus in Final Fantasy X, who's, blindly optimistic, and Van in Final Fantasy XII, at this point, it was certainly a breath of fresh air off the back of an emotionally traumatized Squall, which we had in Final Fantasy VIII. But this said, and potentially to the detriment of the wider story, Zidane's personal storyline develops into a more existential identity crisis after we meet Garland and proceed into Memoria. And this is where we discover he's a genome and essentially a human shell created by Garland, whom he had hoped into turning into a angel of death, as he puts it. So, for my part, I find it impossible to reconcile Zidane with the angel of death idea. And I understand he was kind of adopted by Baku and, developed a much more optimistic personality. But I don't know, whether it's his friendly look or just the total curveball delivery of this revelation. But for me, it just didn't gel with the character that we've come to know and enjoy, for the first 3 discs of this game. Again, I might be getting a bit too subjective here, and maybe other people felt it was a good narrative device, but, the whole genome thing in general, I felt was quite clumsy and complicated, and the theme of identity, that I've said these characters embody, I think they're delivered well enough through Garnet, Vivi and Steiner and, these kind of other characters, and I think it would have been fine if Zidane had been, left as a sort of emotional support character, that was there to support these other characters as they explore the concept of identity on their own, but that's just my opinion. I think the romantic dynamic of the story between Zidane and Garnet is actually a much stronger device than his main story of the genome sort of thing. And while most Final Fantasies do have this romance theme to explore somewhere in the narrative, more often than not we have a sort of reluctant hero and the enamoured female counterpart. But this was pleasantly switched up in Final Fantasy IX, and Zidane's advances are much more often kind of rebuked by Garnet or Steiner, and it's much more tongue-in-cheek, and again I feel owes to the theatrical, almost self-aware leanings of this game. So, as Final Fantasy IX returns to the traditional roots of the series, each character has one of the archetypal job classes that they kind of have in the battle system. So Zidane is a thief, so his aesthetics and handling comprises some of this template. So, for example, his colour palette is overtly green, which does lend itself to the traditional looking thief class styling in Square's games. But it could be argued that Marcus embodies this much more faithfully. But Zidane's skill set also includes the steal ability, and his weapon of choice is a dagger or thief sword, which is the the traditional weapons for this class. Now, digressing slightly on this point of Zidane's weapon, I also find this quite interesting because if you listen to my Final Fantasy VIII segment on Squall, you'll know I made a point about the significance of the hero's weapon and how the significance and ostentatiousness of a protagonist's weapon embodies their status, and indeed, to some extent, their personality. So, we have Tidus's Brotherhood, Cloud's Buster Sword, Squall's Gunblade. They all exude the essence of the hero and their status as the lead character. But oddly, we don't have this so much with Zidane and his daggers. So, apart from briefly, Garnet takes her pseudonym from his weapon and cuts her hair with it, but nothing else of significant is offered, with regards to this weapon. And it's only ever referred to as, in the generic term, dagger, rather than something cool and unique like Buster Sword. And the reason I think this goes back to and reinforces the idea of the ensemble cast of Final Fantasy IX, because there's no one true protagonist around which the entire game hinges. There's arguably no need to introduce one standout weapon to augment, the status of an individual. So as such, I think beyond Zidane's romantic role and being the linchpin between Tantalus and Garnet's party and the royalty, he doesn't really dominate the storyline, and ultimately I really quite like that. So moving on to Garnet, I think Garnet's a really interesting character because instead of the main male lead going through all the profound narrative arc like in most video games, it's actually Garnet who goes through the most profound changes and development in this story. Unlike Zidane, whose origins are kind of thrust upon us, out of the blue, we get an inkling of Garnet having some sort of dramatic past, because in the opening FMV, we actually see, the ship being bounded about on the waves containing, who we later find out to be Garnet's late mother, Jane. And this is an interesting twist, particularly because Garnet's panel reads, "Devotion, someday I'll be queen, but I'll always be myself." We quickly discover that her self, isn't who she initially thinks, and she's certainly not of the lineage of her adopted mother, Queen Brane. So kind of going down the angle of identity and the theme of identity here, Garnet transforms herself numerous times throughout this game, always changing and always evolving until she does essentially, eventually become her true self. And yeah, it's through her that I think we most strongly perhaps see this theme of identity being explored. So at the beginning of the game, we get this surprise immediately that she is wantonly wishing to be kidnapped, leaving her life as a princess behind in order to seek help from her uncle. And at this point in the game, she's quite self-depreciating, and as many Final Fantasy leads, female leads are, but she's also very driven. Once she meets Zidane properly, she adopts the haughtiness of a princess, which is her current identity. But she quickly asks him to assist her in becoming more like a commoner in her speech and actions, which is her second identity that she, seeks to adopt. And it's at this point that she adopts the name Dagger, and in a very symbolic FMV sequence, kind of cuts off her hair. That is the transition of identity from Garnet to Dagger. But then we also have her true birth name, which is Sarah, and she actually goes on to discover her heritage as a summoner from Maiden Sari. So we have a very multifaceted and fractious series of identities going on here with Garnet. It's also interesting to point out, just as an aside, that early on in the game, to escape Alexandria, Garnet also takes part in the stage production of I Want to Be Your Canary, and plays the princess of that play. So we do see this identity switching being played out quite excessively by Garnet, who embodies, devotion to self-discovery and being true to oneself kind of in this game. So I think the idea of devotion being Garnet's panel is quite fitting for Garnet, as throughout all of these identities she always maintains a sense of goodness and a desire to develop herself into the leader she knows that she's meant to be. Garnet's unswaying devotion to other people and goodness is exemplified, really quite well throughout. And in a particularly potent scene after the death of Queen Brane, we find her kind of mourning over this woman who, despite being a warmongerer, destroying civilizations, attempting to extract her eidolons and murder her, Garnet still manages to mourn and forgive this woman. So really quite a profound kind of character development we have with her. In terms of aesthetics, Garnet briefly adopts the archetypal white mage outfit when she escapes Alexandria, and this is later switched out for her orange jumpsuit sort of thing. Much like Zidane and the other characters of this game, her outfit is a mesh of medieval ruffs, pirate boots, and Victorian eloquence, and it meshes together kind of really quite well. Again, as a white mage, she also doubles as the party's summoner, and stocks much of the staple cast of Final Fantasy summons, from Shiva, Ramu, Odin, Ifrit, all of these summons. But interestingly, the summons in this game I found a lot harder to access, as you need to kind of learn them from accessories, which, as in, other games, they're pretty much kind of given to you, awarded to you. And, I just couldn't find myself being bothered to do this particularly often, particularly as, I rarely have a white mage, in my party when I play this game. Now, arguably the next most important character in this hierarchy of characters is Vivi, but I would say that Steiner is certainly on a par with him in terms of screen time, and I really quite like this character, and I feel he's worth discussing now in relation to Garnet. So, Steiner's opening slide states, Dilemma. Having sworn fealty, must I spend my life in Stuart servitude? And it took me a long time, I think, and I'm talking numerous playthroughs, to actually emote with that statement, because I spent so long just hating Steiner. I thought he was two-dimensional, boring, and unfun to look at or play as. But I've since done a kind of complete U-turn with this character, and I've actually grown to appreciate the severity of Steiner's plight. With the theme of identity in mind, we can look at Steiner as a man who has trained and aspired his entire life to be a faithful knight, the code of which, as it always is to protect and serve your country and royal family. And when the Queen puts him in charge of rescuing Garnet, that is his goal, for good or ill, and nothing will kind of prevent him from performing this duty for the Queen. So, and again, Final Fantasy IX being, in this medieval-inspired sort of world, clearly adopts the code of chivalry and the feudal idea of fealty with Steiner. And back in the more overtly, church-governed times, these vows were taken with all due sincerity, which again lends itself to the personality that we find, Steiner having. I mean, quite early on, Steiner's chivalry is used to comedic effect because he conducts himself with the due pomp and ceremony of a knight, but quickly gets frustrated and loses composure when Zidane mocks him by calling him rusty, or Garnet fails to comply with his orders. And in these early scenes it is of course comedic, but the severity of Steiner's plight always shines through alongside this, because he constantly blames himself and fails to deliver within this identity of a royal knight that he feels, he should be living up to. He also stubbornly refuses to acknowledge the evil of Queen Brane, and again, while this did irk me when I was playing because it's so obvious to the player that she is evil, we need to look at Steiner in the context of his identity as a royal knight. Having sworn this duty, if Queen Brane is evil and not the embodiment of grace and virtue, befitting a benevolent queen, then Steiner's entire raison d'etre is based on a lie. And so yeah, it's really quite interesting, once we start kind of looking more closely at, Steiner and why he is the way he is. The way Steiner's story and the evolution of his identity plays out from this stubborn beginning is actually really quite interesting, because he finds his code of knightly propriety conflicting with the events that he finds himself in. So, for example, he despises Zidane and Marcus and Tantalus by default because they are the quintessential scourge of medieval society. They're thieves, kidnappers, and, God forbid, actors. So, he despises these people. However, when he finds people like Zidane showing acts of kindness and Marcus and Blank kind of aiding Princess Garnet, he feels he owes them a debt, and he is mentally incapable of reconciling the idea of a rogue that is also, a good person. Which is, really quite interesting. And, Steiner's revelation finally comes when he discovers Brane is willing to kill Garnet. And it's at this point that he finally liberates himself from his archaic, single-minded identity and reconciles not only with Zidane and Tantalus, but also with General Beatrix, who in a lot of ways is similar to Steiner, and these two are basically, two sides of the same coin. I did also think it was a great little subplot conclusion for Steiner to hook up with Beatrix. I think it was really well delivered because it wasn't too silly, it wasn't too obvious, it was just a nice kind of little subtle thing that kind of took place in the background. So finally moving on to Steiner's aesthetics, he doesn't so much resemble a traditional square knight class, but rather the styling of an actual European medieval knight. The best addition to Steiner's look, I think, is that his armour kind of clanks as you run around, and it's just small additions like this that make Final Fantasy IX quite distinct and amusing from its predecessors, I think. Steiner's also pretty awesome gameplay-wise, and I think he's the strongest in terms of physical attack and defence, so I do find myself using him quite frequently. So, moving on to Vivi, this guy is one of the most recognisable Final Fantasy IX characters, and his narrative arc is one of the more prominent and touching subplots that we actually have in this game. Vivi's introduction slide states, "Sorrow, how do you prove you exist? Maybe we don't exist." And I think this is one of the more prolific and existential plights of a character which we've seen in this game. Indeed, the existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre famously wrote that existence precedes essence. And that is one of the fundamental conundrums of being human that is crystallized perfectly in the story arc of Vivi, who has to reconcile himself as a living, breathing, rational being, for a finite amount of time, but with a purpose that is wholly self-determined, and it's down to him to find meaning in that. So this aspect of identity within the framework of the finiteness of being is delivered in, really quite a harrowing way, mainly because Vivi is a child. So, with Vivi being a child, we have these themes being explored with a degree of naivety, and death, for example, is referred to as stopping. And at various points in the game, Vivi finds it hard to understand why someone would, stop if they weren't sick or injured. His grandfather is one example. And then there's another scene at the Black Mage Village where this question is being considered by the newly self-aware Mr. 57, who has just buried his friend Mr. 36. Vivi is also an interesting character because, although he's scared of the prospect of stopping, he is inherently moral, much like Zidane and Garnet. And when Kuja makes an offer to extend the lives of all the Black Mages if they fight for him, Vivi is horrified that they would actually accept this offer, which puts him in the arena of, Kantian ethics, I think, as his self-determinism is geared towards a collective good, as opposed to selfishness and individualism, which is exhibited, by the other Black Mages who, decide to fight and kill purely to increase their own lives. Turning to the theme of identity with Vivi, I feel Vivi suffers recurring persecution through this game. Many of the inhabitants of Gaia mistake him for one of the soulless Black Mages and frequently react with fear and anger towards him. So we see this again, this kind of moral streak in Vivi. He's kind of mortified that these people would judge him and who he is, based on how he appears to be. And he frequently kind of goes off on these introspective tangents, wondering whether he is indeed one of these monsters, even though his self-awareness kind of rejects fundamentally what it is that they are doing. The conclusion of Vivi's story arc is quite bittersweet. He ultimately finds a reason for being, and oddly somehow manages to create progeny, which is never explained to us. But then, of course, he ultimately dies at his predetermined lifespan, by the time we get to the ending FMV. So, it's quite touching and it's quite tragic because Vivi toils throughout the majority of this game, again tying in with the philosophical model of existentialism, which sees humanity as fundamentally full of anguish and suffering and ultimately death, but also sees the solution to this being to rationally utilize free will, to find meaning in an inherently irrational universe. So this entire philosophical framework being played out by Vivi is one of the most interesting and one of the most touching narrative points, I think, in Final Fantasy IX. Just finally quickly moving on to Vivi's aesthetics. He is very obviously the traditional black mage seen in Square games, just much shorter. His outfit is also much more 17th century privateer looking, than it is a robed mage, because, he has these large gloves and cuffs and, this frock coat. So it ties in again, with the westernized aspects that we've identified in the aesthetics of this game. Finally, of course, as a mage, he utilizes black magic during gameplay, and it's pretty cool. He can be synced up with Steiner in battle, so that Steiner can also kind of carry out magic attacks as well, which is pretty awesome. Off the back of Vivi, I think the final party member that's given a really thorough story to explore here is Freya. Now, just edging slightly into subjectivity here, I have to confess that Freya is my favourite character in this game, and probably in my top 10 Final Fantasy characters, of any given Final Fantasy game. Her introductory panel states, "Despair. To be forgotten is worse than death." And it's this theme that kind of permeates the latter part of Disc 1, where we wind up in Freya's destroyed hometown of Bramecia, and later Clara, where she discovers her long-lost love, Sir Fratley. The twist of her story arc, where she finally reunites with Sir Fratley, kind of outpours all her emotions to him from the years they've been apart, only to have him no longer recognise or remember her, is really quite a brutal turn for this game, and her grief that follows when he departs again is, really quite powerful. For a JRPG video game with no voice acting or detailed facial expressions, to convey these avatars' emotions, I think the writers and also Nobuo Uematsu's score just succeed brilliantly in communicating Freya's tragedy here. But out of all of this, I think the real reason Freya is such an awesome character is the sheer perseverance, that she has. It's worth pointing out that she is one of the only truly non-sexualized, non-maiden in distress female party members we see in probably any Final Fantasy game. She's a straight talker that has the single aforementioned, outburst of emotion. But then she kind of closes up again and conducts herself with a certain stoicism throughout the rest of the game. She cares about the others in the party, of course, but she's just much more pragmatic and reserved about it, which we simply don't see in any other kind of female leads. She kind of reminds me of Auron in Final Fantasy X in a lot of ways, which is just a really good break from the archetypal and slightly sexist mould that Square usually employs here. By the end of the game, Freya has reunited with Fratley, but much like Vivi, it's a bittersweet ending, to quite a tormented character. The duration of the game, Freya has carried a consistent doubt and consistent, kind of despair that, rather than being resolved as a happily ever after, is kind of met halfway. Fratley has not recovered his memories, but states he will try, and Freya kind of sticks by him with this, and the final FMV shows her applauding, Garnet and Zidane in Alexandria. So, we're left to largely interpret the events from here. In terms of identity, I think this theme is explored less through Freya than it is through Sir Fratley, and unlike the others in the main party, Freya is the recipient of the character with the identity crisis, rather than being a party member that's undergoing it themselves. In the wider scope of the game, and how Freya slots in with the rest of the party, I think she works really well, and she kind of falls into this category of the pragmatic, reserved addition to the more emotionally charged and driven characters. She and Zidane have some pretty interesting standoffs, wherein she quite often checks his passionate, often gung-ho temperament with some sound advice, and likewise he often serves to lighten the mood when she is being too obviously introverted or miserable. As a Dragoon job class, Freya's aesthetic makeup bears resemblance to other Final Fantasies in that she has the winged helm, and of course, she uses the spear. Her battle tactic enables her to use jump and lancet, which are also recurring abilities for this job class. So, moving on to Amarant. Now, Amarant is a character that's equally interesting, but also somehow unfulfilling when it comes to the plot of this game. I think the reason is that he was introduced relatively late, so that his narrative arc is quite small, and it's quite two-dimensional, and just it's unfortunate he just doesn't have much time to shine in this game at all. I think this is probably best noted by the fact that he's the only permanent party member that we don't get to control on the field screen at some point. So despite this being a very ensemble and equal game, he's probably one of the more expendable cast members that we have here. Out of all the main party members, he's the only one that isn't furnished with a detailed past. We don't know much about him, except that he was a security guard that was framed for a crime by Zidane in Treno, and now he's a bounty hunter with Lani. So I appreciate that Square has a penchant for mysterious characters, but unlike others such as Orin or Vincent Valentine, where there's an actual payoff, or we can use subquests to discover their past, nothing much is offered with Amarant, and this probably contributes to why he falls short of expectation. But despite this, he is quite cool, and like Freya, he's a good contrast character to the overt optimism that we find in Zidane and the others. Amarant's introductory title states, "Arrogance. The only dependable thing about the future is uncertainty." And true enough, Amarant is quite arrogant, and when he finally catches up to Zidane, he comes across very standoffish and arrogant, and we actually fight him before he actually joins. But again, where Amarant had the potential to come off really cool, even his dialogue and raison d'etre falls quite flat. He opts to join the party and follow Zidane because he's curious about him and about the way he approaches things, which is quite dry in my opinion, and I honestly would have found it more viable for this character if he'd opted to join the party because he's a nihilist and just has nothing better to do, which is essentially how Amarant comes across anyway. I think the only real moment of interest or intrigue that we get with Amarant in terms of plot is the mutual respect he develops for Freya, through latter parts of the game. These two are probably the coolest characters in the party, so it's cool that they have this teaming up thing going on. I think those two would make a great spin-off title personally. But finally, being a monk class, Amarant fights hand to hand, but aesthetically, he doesn't follow in any sort of Square tradition. He's really quite bizarre looking. And Final Fantasy IX takes this more cartoonish approach, and they had considerable license with their characters. But even within this framework, Amarant, with his height and his massive forearms and his big hair, kind of really stands out more than any of the others. You can tell they've tried delivering more on this mystique angle of his character because his face is always obscured. But again, despite how cool he looks, unfortunately, we just don't get enough delivery with his storyline, which is just unfortunate. Now, moving on to Eiko. Much like Amarant, Eiko comes to us relatively late in the game, and is one of those Final Fantasy characters that generally is quite hit or miss with fans. I mean, for my part, I think Eiko contributes well to developing Garnet's storyline. She's familiar with the history of Maiden Sari and the Summoner's heritage, so she delivers a lot, to this end. But on the other hand, her personal plot points generally consist of trying to woo Zidane, which is really quite weird, and it's not really a plot point that I take interest in, even though it's designed to be, pure comedy. Although I do find it funny, there's a bit where she gets stuck in a chandelier, having just written a love letter to Zidane, and she has to throw it down to Baku to deliver it instead, but Zidane never actually receives that letter. We also find her stuck in a tree or branch, I can't quite remember, when we first come across her outside Condi Piti, so this is quite a humorous recurrence that we have with Eiko, because she's so small and getting stuck everywhere. But, I suppose we could argue Eiko explores the theme of identity in her wooing of Zidane, because she's constantly trying to appear older and do things that she perceives as mature, such as cooking for everyone when she first meets them. She's also really bossy, stubborn and brash with people, which is again a facade of her truer identity, which is that of a lonely child who's been raised, alone among Moorals. Her slide reads, solitude, I don't want to be alone anymore. And this is the crux of Eiko's character and her personal story arc. You know, we generally find her trying to build bridges with the outside world and make connections with people, you know, throughout this game. That said, much like how I discussed kind of Selphie in Final Fantasy VIII, despite empathising with Eiko's plight, I do still find her annoying, and I basically rarely introduce her to my party because her dialogue and general presence just annoys me and I'm just not interested in it. Again, like Garnet, Eiko is a summoner, white mage, and her aesthetics are very vibrant and childlike, but aside from this, you know, again, I just don't find there's much really to discuss about, you know, this character in terms of aesthetics. Moving finally on to Quina Quen, probably the most bizarre character in the party as a genderless chef hat wearing creature known as a Q. Quina is another one of these hit and miss characters, as they're quite periphery to the main themes and story, and is clearly put in as overt comic relief, which some people don't like. But for me, Quina is a really interesting contrast to the emotional plights of the main cast, and also brings, you know, his or her own robust, if rudimentary, philosophy of life to the table. I think of Quina as a wise fool, and looking at her slide, which states, "Indulgence, I do what I want, you have problem?" We can see a distinct theme playing out with Quina, which is contrary to the collective good of the rest of the party. Just referring back to Vivi and, you know, how I suggested Vivi embodied a Kantian sort of ethics where he strove towards a collective moral goodness. Quina, on the other hand, seems to rely on a much more secular, hedonistic idea of good, which is a personal goodness. And if Vivi and Zidane embody the ideals of Immanuel Kant, then Quina could be argued to embody the ideals of Aristippus, which was a Greek philosopher who considered pleasure as the highest form of good, you know, personal pleasure as the highest form of good. So rather than having a backstory to explore, Quina's narrative arc is generally explored in small, self-contained active time events, with a humorous edge, and generally involving food. You know, Quina fascinates me because, although joining the main party of heroes, unlike the others, Quina does not have a moral standard to abide by. You know, there's no desire to contribute towards the collective good. Quina is the embodiment of free will in its truest and arguably most vulgar form, which is individualistic indulgence of self. You know, indeed, Quina spends a lot of time in this game attempting or threatening to eat sentient beings, you know, including a chocobo egg, you know, in the Black Mage village. So, the way that Quina always brushes paths with the party, but goes off on, you know, his or her own accord and reappears at various locations, I think just further augments and illustrates the absolutism of this character's free will. And I just really like how this character was defined and delivered, and I think perhaps they could have, you know, done the same with Amarant, in that because the character doesn't impact the main story too much, there's no reason to have them around at all times. And you could, you know, maybe just give them a bit more exposition through active time events instead of main gameplay dialogue. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Quina. You know, again, he or she adopts a job class which is as a blue mage, and having the blue magic ability. But aesthetically, Quina is entirely unique to the world of Final Fantasy IX. The chef's outfit and fork weapon kind of augment the comic character of Quina, and it's interesting to note that etymologically, Quina means eat in Japanese, and Quen means to not eat in Japanese, which neatly establishes this character's entire reason for being and the two states of Quina's being. So, now that I'm finished with the main cast, there's a couple more sub-characters I want to discuss that I feel explore this theme of identity, and more specifically, duality, you know, the doppelganger, and the odd couple dynamic with respect to identity. I find that Final Fantasy IX has numerous examples of character duality, wherein one character's identity is completed only by the existence of another. First off, we have Marcus and Blank. Now, these two are best friends and refer to one another as bro, you know, and they are evidence to exist in an intrinsic sort of coexisting way that sees Marcus, for example, going out on his own mission to find a cure for blank when he's petrified in the evil forest. And I feel that there's an inherent coexistence here where Marcus cannot live without blank and vice versa, which leads them to completing one another's personalities. But that's one of the more subtle examples that I've identified. But more obviously, we have the Tantalus Nero twins, Benero and Zenero, who are identical in look and movement. You know, they don't feature much in the game, but again, you know, we see this twin dynamic going on, and you know, there's just further evidence of dual identities and coexistence going on here. You know, with regard to identities. And we also have the quite menacing doppelganger relationship of Zorn and Thorn, who embody really quite sinister dual traits that are quite unsettling. So, for example, exclaiming the same sentences but in opposing grammatical formats and synchronizing each other's movements. You know, these guys actually really quite freak me out, and it seems like Square has played on the idea of the doppelganger being a harbinger of bad luck and misfortune, because these two are completely without morals. You know, they're really quite masochistic, which we see through the scene where they extract the eidolons from Garnet, for example. You know, they're completely without emotional empathy towards anyone else in this game. You know, the way they interact is also quite interesting, though, because it reminds me of other examples of the odd couple dynamic, particularly the movie Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is based on two characters from Hamlet, and you know, the film takes place in the offstage elements of these two characters in Hamlet, basically. And there's this weird interconnectedness between character and dialogue in that movie that I really kind of see similarities with Zorn and Thorn in. And moving on finally to the last example of duality that I see in this game, and the last character that we really have of note, which is Kuja. Now, Kuja is Zidane's doppelganger in disguise, and you know, as a bad guy, Kuja is really, again, one of these conflicting characters with fans. You know, personally, I don't mind him that much. I like that he is a manipulator. I like that he orchestrates things from behind the curtain, and I like that how he defied Garland to come down to Gaia to seek out Zidane. You know, this element of the story arc rings similarities with, you know, Lucifer defying God and being cast out of heaven, and it's quite an interesting angle to take, I think. But again, the only reason this plot fails to deliver is because it was left so late to have this reveal being made to us. You know, the final revelation. Actually, another good point on Kuja is the final revelation, where he has this moral epiphany at the end of the game and apologizes for his actions. You know, I felt that was quite a nice turn. We rarely, if ever, have a main antagonist in a Final Fantasy game realizing the error of their ways, and the ambiguous ending where we don't know if Kuja is alive or dead is also quite good. You know, Final Fantasy IX is a lot more of a light-hearted throwback game, despite the themes being explored. So I think they had license to kind of not show Kuja fundamentally dying, you know, at the end of the game and having this moral epiphany. But I think the main gripe that many have with Kuja is that he's excessively narcissistic and almost offensively camp in terms of aesthetics and speech. Personally, I don't understand why, you know, he's dressed the way he is. It is kind of crazy and, you know, overtly, you know, effeminate. But I would argue, you know, that this isn't the only villainous faux pas that Square has made. You know, if we just look at Seymour from 10 or Vane from 12, you know, they have equally kind of camp villains. So it just seems like a thing that they've decided to start doing. And ultimately, you know, it doesn't really bother me too much. He is suitably ruthless enough to get away with this, I think. In terms of the theme of identity, it's basically culminated in this game by Kuja, you know, and his looks, because of course he is revealed to be a genome and an identical twin to Zidane, and it is through his own rejection of who he really is that he alters his appearance and rebels against Garland and tries adopting, you know, this kind of new identity. So we find ourselves going full circle with duality and identity, and I think if the writing was just a little bit tighter and the story was just a little more cohesive, that they really could have delivered these themes with the same brilliant structure that we saw, with Final Fantasy VIII. So just before I wrap up with Final Fantasy IX, lastly, of course, you can't discuss Final Fantasy without discussing the Uematsu score. So moving into the music of Final Fantasy IX, I think there's definitely a distinction in the sound that Uematsu has opted to go for here, and I think it's delivered really well. It matches the more magical Kings and Queens feel of this game. The palette of instruments includes lutes, pianos, woodwinds, strings, and it feels immediately like we're being placed in this quasi-medieval world. Right from the opening, where the piece, The Place I'll Return Someday, plays, we have that sense of medieval Europe, which is fantastic. Most of the themes in the soundtrack work along the same compositional lines, being adaptations of The Place I'll Return Someday or Melodies of Life. But my favourite themes are the ones that regrettably don't actually feature that much. But these for me crystallise the essence of why Uematsu is such a genius. So the Burmesian Kingdom theme is absolutely fantastic, and it's really quite a haunting piece that exemplifies Uematsu's genius. Forgetting the essence of an emotional state and creating a beautiful composition out of it. It's impossible not to feel sorry for Freya while this theme is playing out. On the other hand, we also have a piece like We Are Thieves, which is an excellent example of a more light-hearted, tongue-in-cheek piece that works really quite well to establish the characters of Tantalus. It's a piece of music that's very telling that, the rogues are on stage now, as it were, and it's a piece that I think would be really well adapted to real instruments, but unfortunately I haven't managed to find anyone that's covered that. So yeah, a lot of people like to compare Uematsu's output with other games, and I've already stated that Final Fantasy VIII has my favourite soundtrack. That is my favourite soundtrack by Uematsu. But for this particular world and this particular Final Fantasy, I think the soundtrack completely nails it, and it is an excellent companion to the world and story that we find ourselves in. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything I was going to discuss about this game. And I've tried doing it as concisely as I could. But I think this is a landmark game, as I stated at the beginning. It's a fantastic hyphen between the PlayStation installments and the next generation of Final Fantasy games that saw and continue to see this series take a dramatic and unprecedented shift, for good or ill, into the realms of the action-based, technologically innovative and overtly new style of gameplay.